I'm Harv Nagra. I'm an operations consultant, a former in house agency operations director, and head of brand communications at Scoro. Welcome to The Handbook, the Agency Operations Podcast, a space where we talk to fellow experts and operations leaders about agency life, discussing the challenges keeping us up at night, as well as strategies that help make things run a little bit smoother. Hey all, welcome to The Handbook. It's natural that every agency experiences growing pains over the years. And on top of that, there's external factors to contend with, like competition, changing technology, and the economy keeping us on our toes, or worse. I've worked at places that had almost everyone at one point in a client-facing role, and no one other than the finance person looking after the way things were run internally. At one point, it felt like things were being held together by tape, and the dam was about to burst. That's a bad place to find yourself in. But hopefully, none of us are in a situation as dire. But when there are those growing pains and those external challenges, how do you navigate these? And in fact, what areas should you even be looking at when assessing your own situation? That's the theme of today's episode. Our guest today, Manish Kapur, has been working in the agency operations space for over 25 years. He made a start as a designer and quickly realized that his skills were better suited to looking at the bigger picture. Over the years, he's worked his way up and landed a role as executive operations director at what is now Design Bridge and Partners, and his clients include the likes of Green Park Digital, Innocent, and more. On a personal level, I'm such a big fan, which is why I'm so excited about today's conversation. I've been in roundtables with Manish and follow him on LinkedIn, and when he speaks, he really gets to the essence of an issue and has very clear ideas and advice on how to overcome challenges that might be blocking an agency's success. He's worked with agencies from 20 people to those that are over 500. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Let's get into it. Manish, I want to start off the podcast with just talking to you about how you got into the agency space and operations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, very few of us actually go into ops straight from college or university. Maybe in the future it may be a course, so it might be different. But like many, I started off wanting to do something different. I wanted to be a designer. In school, my first love was always art. I wasn't particularly academic and I enjoyed art. I particularly got into the whole hip hop culture, into the whole thing around breakdancing and graffiti. But I hasten to add, I didn't paint walls. I just kept my stuff in my sketchbook. There was quite an influential book called Subway Art, which kind of was quite influential as far as getting me into the world of art and design. And I wanted to basically leave and design record sleeves. That was my aim. When I left, I actually joined a print course. And that was the sort of decision prior to actually going on to do a BTEC or a degree. But I actually got a job quite early. And much to my parents' dismay, I started working at the age of 17. Okay. I was quite fortunate. Macs were just about coming in then. I'm kind of showing my age a bit there. And I joined an agency where the founder had invested quite heavily in an Apple Mac. I remember it was £16,000, which was a lot of money then. And he said, look, I've got this Mac. None of the guys want to use it because they don't want to do stuff traditionally with magic markers and things like that. And I'm looking for someone to come along and just use it, make use of the equipment. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. He goes, believe me, Manish, if you learn this, it's going to put you in, it'll give you quite a head start because I personally believe this is going to be the future. That was his words, and so right he was. So I started off as a designer, but I realized quite early on that my creative abilities weren't up to my peers. And so I slightly pivoted because I realized I was actually quite good at managing creatives. And so I took on more studio management roles and eventually into ops as that became a thing. And worked for a couple of larger design agencies where I kind of really honed in my skills.
Excellent. So I guess, Manish, the reason we're having this conversation is to talk about business maturity and more specifically, kind of the factors that might get in the way of your growth or development as an agency. So first question, do you start, when you go and start speaking to your clients, do you have any shorthand kind of markers that you can pick up immediately and say, okay, based on what I'm hearing really quickly, these are the kind of categories I'm starting to find or classify an agency into?
Yeah, absolutely. I think size plays a big factor. I think, most agencies, when they're quite small, they're just thinking about growth and it's all about business development. And then it gets to a certain point where things become a little bit chaotic, that their team isn't enjoying it as much. Maybe they're not as profitable. Maybe the workload or the work quality has dropped. But I tend to find around about the 2025 person agency is when they start to really think we need to get someone in to help with ops. Either they'll bring someone in or they might bring in someone like myself as a consultant. But it's when
Hmm.
you get to that kind of size when business gets serious and they're working with much bigger clients. And unless they've
Yeah.
got really smooth, streamlined operations, that's when things can start to go wrong. So I
Hmm.
think size plays quite a big factor.
Right. That's really interesting. It's probably that kind of organic way of working has worked up until that size, and then you start feeling the pain
Yeah.
points. Do you think after that point, like, is it kind of smooth sailing from there, from your experience, or does there come another kind of benchmark that you see where it's time for another audit? Although
Yeah,
that should be an ongoing thing.
absolutely. The reality is it never really stops.
Hmm.
There's no agency that's perfect. There's always going to be some issues. And as you grow and you take on more clients and more people, then you're constantly under review. And I would say that, initially when you get to around the 25 mark, and then when you get to 50, and then when you get up to
Mm.
100, you're constantly reviewing it. And I think the reality is that you're always going to be reviewing your processes because they don't always work the way that you want. And you just need to look at them again and just make sure they're optimized at all times. That's always my
Mm.
recommendation, is never really stop.
Hmm. And, when you start engaging with somebody, they've kind of brought you on to come in and support. What kinds of issues are you seeing that people are having?
Yeah. Well, I would love it if they approached me 6 months prior to them having a challenge. Sadly, that's not the case. A problem has arisen. First of all, they've ignored it, and then they've tried to fix it themselves. And eventually they thought, we need some help. Operations is still seen as a luxury problem. Once you've got the work coming in, if you've got an operation problem, it's probably because you're too busy, which is a nice place to be.
Mm.
But it means it's not always the priority.
Yeah.
But when it does become a problem, that's when it's quite serious. And normally there's some form of trigger event. So normally when I'm called in, is something's happened and it needs to be sorted quite quickly. So it could be anything from the owner themselves, the agency owner feeling burnt out, everything's resting on their shoulders and they just can't, take that anymore. And it's just the stress is building and the anxiety and the sleepless nights. It
Mm.
could be that their revenue is increased. This is quite common. The revenue is
Mm.
actually increased, but their profitability is not in line or growing at the same level. And in fact, they were probably more profitable when they were half the size. And
Mm.
then the question is, what's the point of taking on this additional headache or more
Mhm.
work, managing more people when in fact I'm making less money? They
Mm.
could be a situation where they've lost a big client purely down to the quality of the work, or in fact they want a big client and they're now thinking, well, how are we going to deliver this work that's required for this client without the right team structure? Another
Mhm.
quite common one is staff retention. They're
Yeah.
not retaining people because things are very chaotic. People are getting stressed out and they're going to their competitors. So there normally is some major trigger event. It's very rarely a sort of, actually, we might have a problem. Could you come and smooth this over? It's normally,
Mm.
we have an issue. Can you come and sort this out? And normally they need that sorted quite quickly.
Mhm. I think there's probably a thing as well that when you're kind of in the trenches, especially when you kind of haven't had that kind of operational excellence kind of experience, that you kind of miss some of the signals and you just kind of ignore them, or like you're saying, just kind of patch them over and hope for the best. And then it comes to a bit of a boiling point, doesn't it? When it's like, okay, we really need to get this sorted.
Yeah, 100%. It's quite easy. I think I wouldn't necessarily say I'm the smartest person in the room. It's just I come in there without any kind of baggage.
Mm.
And so I can see things that maybe others won't. And we've all been in there. When I worked within agencies and ops role, there was things
Mhm.
that I missed because as well as trying to sort out the operations, I still had a day-to-day job of ensuring jobs were properly resourced and projects were
Mhm.
being delivered on budget. And it's hard to try and cover absolutely everything. But I suppose the advantage I have, I come in there with a fresh pair of eyes and maybe
Yeah.
I see things that others won't. And that's purely because
Mhm.
I'm not involved in their day-to-day operations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And on that note, do you see over the past couple of years, do you see more agencies with an operations person in-house, or do you think that's not changed and it's about the same as where it was a couple of years ago? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm pleased to say it's definitely increasing.
Yeah.
It's becoming much more of a major role. I'm part of many cohorts. I have my own little LinkedIn group as well, and it's becoming more and more common. And I was surprised actually when I was trying to find people that maybe I could invite to my group, it was literally
Hmm.
thousands. And I'm
Really?
really pleased to see that agencies have recognized that to ensure that they run a successful, profitable, and importantly, a sustainable agency, having someone in that ops function is absolutely critical. And
Hmm.
when people get them in, they're like, why didn't I get you in sooner? That's what you
Hmm.
always hear. Why didn't I get this person in sooner? Because they really are the glue. They're the ones that put everything together and allow
Hmm.
everyone else to do their jobs better. as well as allowing the agency to produce great work and actually be quite profitable. So it's a
Hmm.
key role. And I'm pleased that agencies these days, when they get to a certain size, the first thing they think about is, okay, we need someone to come in and manage our ops. And the term creative operations has become pretty much a standard thing now, to
Hmm.
the point there's even events for ops people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm really pleased that that's happened. I wish that was there maybe 10 years ago when I could have done with that help and having some,
Hmm.
peers to talk to and share, challenges with. Unfortunately, at that time, it didn't exist so much. There were student managers, but ops wasn't what it is today. But I'm really
Mm.
pleased that it's on the rise and it's got a prominent role to play within agency land.
Absolutely agree with you there. I've seen more and more of those communities pop up, and including the reason why we're launching this podcast as well is that there's one more place to have those conversations. And
Yeah,
I just think you can't have enough. I always think that operations can, there might be a dozen designers in an agency or developers or account managers, but the ops people don't have like, you don't have a dozen ops people in an
no.
agency. So you end up not having that kind of support to bounce ideas off of and stuff like that. So it's great to see so many kind of groups come together and start having those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I think, there are other people within the agency where roles where there might be a large client servicing team, creatives, developers, and they can bounce things off each other and share
Hmm.
issues and challenges. And, ops are normally the only one person, at a push they may have an assistant, but predominantly they are there by themselves and it's up to
Hmm.
them to try and manage all the challenges. Now there's groups out there that you can share those with and just have a bit of a sense check, am I going crazy here? Or is
Hmm.
there things that need to be changed within the internal ways of working? And I think it helps. Having that support makes the job a lot easier. And it is not an easy job, by any means. But having that kind
Absolutely.
of support out there makes things a lot easier.
Definitely. Definitely. So before we get into it, it's been a tough couple of years. Are you seeing kind of the challenges agencies are facing? Is it just about keeping a healthy pipeline and profitability at the moment, or has that shifted to where people were looking for more accelerated growth in the past, or looking for acquisition or anything like that? Have you seen any shifts in that regard?
Yeah, I think by all means, I think last year seems to be pretty tough for a lot of
Yeah.
agencies. I kind of think, everyone kind of hoped that the first quarter would have been a lot better. That's not been the case. It's still been a little bit slow. Things are
Mm.
certainly starting to improve now we get into the second quarter of this year, but the
Hmm.
year didn't start off as well as people hoped. And I think that always causes challenges. One thing I would say is that an agency becomes least profitable when it starts to add more and more people without reviewing its current ways of working and making
Mm.
sure that the people they've currently got are being properly utilized. And I think that's one of the things I've always recommend is that that's one thing you need to look at your staffing levels, making sure you've got the right people within your agency. And as you grow, make sure everyone is probably fully utilized before you add to those numbers. Because
Hmm.
you may not hit your overall revenue target, but ultimately you still can hit a good profitability level if you keep a tab of your outgoings.
Absolutely. So, in looking at your website and talking to you, I know that you have your own kind of methodology and assessment criteria. And in fact, got a great free tool on your website as well, where people can use that to get a quick temperature check on where they're at and where they could improve. Can you tell us a bit about the areas that your assessment or your methodology covers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to realize that when there's a particular problem, it normally
Hmm.
relates to something else. And if you try and just solve that one problem without viewing the sort of other factors around that, you end up with a bit of a sticking plaster where it may have
Hmm.
not completely solved the issue. The only way to really do that is to make sure that you've checked everything to make sure that all the other areas are working really well. So, for
Hmm.
example, I might be called in to look at resource management. Our resource management could be better. And you may start off by just looking at the processes and the resource management skills and the tools that they're using. But in fact, a resource manager requires a lot more support, primarily from client servicing, from creatives. And you want to make sure that are they supplying the resource manager with the right information? Are they giving
Hmm.
the right kind of inputs in a timely fashion? So that's just making it a little bit broader. So when someone calls me in and says we've got a particular challenge in a certain area, I do kind of insist on let me do an audit just to make sure that I've covered all the bases and the recommendations that I put forward are really going to solve your problems. They're not like a sticking plaster. And
Yeah.
so I've got like four areas, four key pillars that I focus on when I do an audit. And
Hmm.
that's around leadership, financial management, people, and processes. And I find that those four pretty
Hmm.
much cover all the areas from an internal perspective that I need to make sure that I've looked at to make sure they're working really well before I try and solve the core issue.
Hmm. Okay. Excellent. And so why don't we get into it? Again, leadership, I saw somewhere that you have kind of these subcategories. So maybe I'll just kind of flag them for our audience as well, if that's
Sure.
okay. And then
Yeah.
really happy to have you kind of just comment on the whole concept in general.
Yeah.
So I think you have communication skills, decision making, effective delegation, time management, and team building, all linked to leadership. So yeah, just tell us your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a kind of misconception that when someone gets promoted to a position of where they're line managing others, that they have these natural skills that they're brilliant managers, and that's rarely the case. I
Hmm.
personally was a terrible delegator. It took me ages
Hmm.
to get better at it and to let go of the tools and
Yeah.
actually be able to delegate to other people. And I think when people get promoted, there is an assumption that all of a sudden they have all these skills where they're really good at delegating, time management, developing people, and they just don't. And I think it's important to recognize that we all need development and training. And so there will be certain areas that do need to be improved. And I think there's
Hmm.
a saying, isn't it, that people don't leave companies, they leave bad bosses. And I think that's so true. And I think it's because people haven't been properly trained. They've
Mm.
got promoted and they may be good in some areas and not in others. And I think part of my audit is really to assess the leadership team. And
Mhm.
you find out when you talk to their sort of team members, you get to know quite quickly what they're doing well and what they're not. And if one particular team member is mentioning the same thing about their line manager, then clearly that's an area of development that they need to have a
Mhm.
look at. But I think going in there and accepting that we're not natural managers, there's certain training that we're going to all need, but where those weaknesses are and offering the right kind of training. And
Mhm.
also having the manager to also be open to the fact that, fair enough, I'm good at these things, but not that. And yes, I do need help with delegation as an example. And what
Mhm.
training can I have for that? I think it's really important.
Mhm. I have 2 comments there, I guess. One thing I think as kind of agency leaders, and the management, also need to recognize is that, whether somebody has maybe, the aptitude to be a great manager versus being an individual contributor, 'cause it's quite possible somebody would be much more successful if they were allowed to just do what they're really excellent
Yeah.
at, and not have to manage a team, right? So I think it's important as individuals to recognize that, and perhaps also at the kind of management level. But that being said, sometimes in order to move up in your career, you do have to take on those management responsibilities, like you're saying. And if that's the case, how do you help, or what do you recommend?
Yeah, I think it's being that honest, and I think recognizing where you got those weaknesses. And
Hmm.
you're right. I think, most people are technicians, they are good
Hmm.
at something and
Hmm.
they get promoted to a management role, which normally involves managing a team.
Hmm.
And so if you're going to be effective as managing teams, managing people, you have to be honest with what you think you're good at and what you're not. And just not feeling, embarrassed by the fact that you don't have a certain skill in a certain area and putting your hand up and asking for that help. But you're right. I think also, the agency owners, their bosses need to be supportive and say, hey, look, we're promoting because we know you've got all these great skills and we'd love you
Hmm.
to manage a team and pass on all your knowledge. But we totally accept there'll be certain areas of management that maybe you're not so good at. Let's
Hmm.
work through it together and find out
Hmm.
what we can do to try and help. And maybe that might involve some additional training or doing some courses. But I think
Hmm.
that's the first step is just acknowledgement and not feeling, ashamed that you've got weaknesses in these areas.
Absolutely. So that takes us nicely into kind of your next area, which is people. And if I look at some of those sub areas that you've identified, there's strength and skills, feedback and performance reviews, training and professional development, employee onboarding, and succession planning. So tell us your thoughts
Yeah,
on people.
absolutely. Well, end of the day, an agency's greatest asset is its people.
Hmm.
There is no kind of proprietary tech or anything like that. It's all about people. And it amazes me that agencies can spend such a long time trying to acquire the talent, but not an equal measure about trying to retain the talent. And it's very easy to lose people by not doing some really basic stuff. And it starts right from the beginning, about how you onboard an individual, what support they're given, what career paths they have, how they can see their roles. Things have slightly changed now with the cost of living, but I always personally believe that progression beats pay. So if someone feels that they've got a good career path and they can, move up with the company, if a recruiter contacts them and says, "Look, we'll pay you an extra couple of grand to move to this other agency," they're more likely to say, "Well, actually, I'm okay here at the moment.
Hmm.
I can see where I'm going. I like the
Hmm.
people. I like the culture. Great work. I think I'm going to stick with it." If that doesn't exist and someone comes and offers more money, they are going to be tempted. And then
Hmm.
all those efforts to acquire that talent, in some case train them up, is lost because then they just left and joined one of your competitors. But there are some basics, and it starts from the onboarding, giving the support, having proper performance reviews. When the
Mm,
agency I was at, I was there for 15 years, and they had an amazing track record of retaining people, and they had 500 people across the group. And on average, people stayed for 7.5 years, which is just phenomenal in our sort of world. And that was predominantly because they had really good formal personal review and development system where people could see exactly where their job career was going and where they might be in
mm,
the future. And
mhm,
that made a massive difference. And when I go into agencies, I always say that is really important.
mm,
Don't just give it lip service where you might do a bit of a half an hour review at the end of the year. Really
mm,
spend the time with your people to ensure they've got a clear path and they can see how they're going to grow and develop within your company.
mhm. That's a really good point. The thing with that whole performance review process is that it can be very laborious as well. Have you seen any best practices that can make that a little bit more efficient, but also really effective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I get it. I think ultimately people are trying to fit this in with their day jobs.
Yeah.
And it's hard to carve out the time, particularly if you've got quite a few people within your team. But I think having a very clear process,
Mm,
guidelines, templates, all those things help. So if you
mhm,
have a very clear process about how you're going to do your review, is there going to be like a feedback form? Is that something
mm,
that you fill out and someone else fills out? It's the same form, but just, from different perspectives, how
mhm.
that information is collected, how long the meetings run, how you're going to
Yeah.
feedback. All of those things come into play. And it's obviously down to the agency's culture. Everyone's going to do it slightly differently. But if you want to make it most efficient and effective, I think you've got to start to add an element of process and templatation within that. So not everyone's doing their own thing. There
Mm,
is a consistent way of actually reviewing people, giving them the opportunity to feedback, also gaining feedback from other team members so you get a good
mhm,
360 review of how they're performing and knowing how you need to compile that, how you need to feedback, and how you need to do some kind of summary. But the most important thing is it's not just a one-off event. You might do that, but then there's actions on the back of that. And
mm,
that's where you need to have regular follow-up. So it might be quick monthly catch-ups just to see people are on track and they're achieving their goals. I don't think you can just do it once and then leave it and hope that people achieve those by themselves. That's where the support comes in and making sure
mhm.
that you're there on a regular basis on their side, helping them achieve the goals that they want to achieve.
Absolutely. And do you need a tool or a platform to run this, or do you think fundamentally, you can create your own kind of tools and templates?
Yeah, I think there are some really good tools out there, particularly
Hmm.
HR tools, really good
Is there
ones that.
anything you really recommend or like,
Well,
or
Bamboo is one that always comes up, and I think it's
which
great
one?
because
Oh
Bamboo
yeah.
HR,
Okay.
and that's
Hmm.
just one of many, and I think that's quite good at getting everything into one place and monitoring
Mm-hmm.
it. But the key thing is having individuals, the line managers, properly trained,
Mm.
and it's all about going in there with listening. This is one skill that managers need to get really good at. The reason why
Yeah.
we're given 2 ears and one mouth, and making sure that you really are genuine active listening, which means that you're asking open-ended questions. If
Yeah.
you're reviewing someone and you find out you're doing the majority of the talking, then you've done it completely wrong. You should be talking 20% of the time, and the person that you're reviewing should be talking 80% of the time. So it's that kind of variance of the conversation, and I think that's really important. So the first thing is being properly trained and knowing how to get the best out of people. Now the
Mm-hmm.
reality is there's going to be some elements that are difficult to deal with, but they have to be. Most
Mm.
managers tend to sort of shy away with it, but it doesn't do the person that you're managing any benefits of not talking about it. And there's kind of like there's a bit of a sandwich of where you do start off with the good bits, then you hit them with the bad bits, and then with the good bits. And I think that's really important, but that all comes down to training. So yes, you
Mm.
can use a tool, and there's some really good ones out there, or you might have your own. But the number one thing I think is actually having line managers who are properly trained, who know how to do effective reviews, where that
Mm.
individual, even if it's something that's not so great, still leaves motivated and up for the challenge. And I think that's what's more important.
That's such a good point. Such a good point. And okay, on that note, we're going to move into the next category, financial management. And here you've identified looking at revenue streams, client and project profitability, resource utilization, pricing strategy, and fee income forecasting.
Yeah, this for agencies tends to be the weakest area because they're
Mm,
not naturally finance people.
mm,
And I think there's a big difference between having someone who's at a finance director level versus someone who's a bookkeeper. And most
mhm,
agencies obviously start with bookkeepers, and I'm not knocking what they do; an amazing job. But ultimately, you have to be able to review the data. The data
Hmm.
tells you a lot about what's going on within your agency, and it's the hard facts about what's working well and what's not. And I'm a big believer that the good finance people look at leading indicators, which is they look at the figures and tell you what's going to be happening in the future, versus lagging, which is kind of reporting on what's happened. That's
Yeah.
useful, but at the end of the day, it's happened. There's nothing you can do about it. But reviewing all your finances ultimately ensures that you're going to run a profitable agency and where that leaking bucket is. Unless you're reviewing all those things, you don't know where you're making profit and where you're not. And
Hmm.
profitability just doesn't happen by itself. You've got to work at it. And normally there's a number of different factors that's causing you to be not as profitable as you like. And having good finances and good financial management will allow you to find out where those leaks are, so you can
Hmm.
basically, fill that. And I think starting off by looking at your key finances, certain KPIs, what your revenue targets are, how profitable you are with certain clients. If there's clients that aren't particularly profitable, there's certain teams. If people are being properly utilized, all those things are really important. And I think even if you're quite small as an agency, it's still worth getting some help. And I think there's people out there at the moment who are very, very experienced that will offer fractional support. But if you want to grow a sustainable, profitable agency, having someone in who can really look at the finances of what's going on beyond just your P&L, I think is
Hmm.
absolutely critical. And there you'll know where you're doing well, where you're not doing so well. And if you
Hmm.
start off with a good habit when you're quite small, as you grow bigger, those habits remain. And in fact, you strengthen.
Absolutely. Um, you identified kind of a lot of KPIs there, but you also mentioned leading indicators. Can you give us some examples of what those are?
Yeah, I think having a financial forecast is quite key. So
Hmm.
we've all got targets, but knowing exactly where the work's going to come in. That can
Mm.
also help. And I always feel that financial forecasts are the best tool that a resource manager can have. Not the
Mhm.
spreadsheet or the resource chart, but I believe that if you know what's coming in, you can plan for anything. I worked in agencies of 5 people and I worked in agencies with 100 people in the studio. Give me 100 any day. If it's properly planned and you know it's coming, you can manage that. A studio
Mhm.
of 5 people not knowing what's going to come in tomorrow is super stressful. And so the financial forecast is not just about knowing what's going to happen in the future and where you need to either cut spending or increase it. So you might look at it and go, well, actually, we've got quite a bit of work coming in. We may need to start looking at freelancers, or actually it's slowing down. We might need to cut freelancers. Or there might be around holidays. People are
Mm.
going away. We've got this amount of work coming in. Are we going to have any problems? Or if
Mhm.
it's less quieter, do we encourage people to take some time off because we're going through a quiet period? So that's just one
Mm.
indicator about just using the finance forecast, looking into
Mhm.
the future and being able to make some decisions on how you need to run your agency and how you ensure that you keep profitability where you want it to be by just looking at where the revenue is going to be in 3 months' time.
Thanks for that. So we're kind of moving into your final pillar, process, and here you've identified project planning and scoping, workflow optimization, effective resource management, budgeting and cost control, and tech stack integration.
Yeah, this is always a bit strange and people are surprised, but as a ops person, I'm not a big fan of process,
Mhm.
which is always a bit of people sort of raise an eyebrow when I mention that. And the reason being is that embedding process is really difficult. And if you speak to a lot of people in the ops roles, trying to enforce process is hard. One thing I would say from the get go is if you don't have support from the most senior people within your agency, don't even bother trying to implement some change because it won't stick.
Mhm.
So the
Mhm.
first thing is really important is making sure that you've got advocates at the most senior level who are supporting you and making sure that other people are compliant to what you're doing. But saying that, ultimately processes are really difficult. And I think what's more important is implementing best practice. And that's the difference. So you can map out a process and go, this is how
Mhm.
we need to get from A to B. But more importantly is what are the things that if we don't do, the project will either get derailed and we won't
Mm.
successfully deliver it. So for instance, it might be that we have to make sure that we have a good brief. That
Mm.
is an absolute given. Doesn't matter what size of project, how quick we're running, we have to have a good brief. Or it could
Mhm.
be that we need to make sure we have time to review the work before it goes to the client. It could be at the end, we have to do wash ups. So I think you can try and embed a process, but I prefer to be a little bit more flexible and agile. I'm a
Mhm.
firm believer that ops is not black and white, it's very much grey. And one week is very different from the next. And the best ops people are the ones that can bend and flex depending on where the requirements are and what clients need. And if you're able to do that, your job becomes less stressful, but only if you have a set of best practices where you feel
Mm.
comfortable not following the process all of the
Mhm.
time, but
Mm.
accepting that if you have those best practices, then you'll make sure the process is solid enough that things won't go wrong. And that's the difference. And I always advocate, get your best practices identified and stick with them. As far as your processes, have something that you know is an ideal way of working, but
Hmm.
be flexible in how you do that.
That's great advice. So we've covered the four pillars, Manish. And is there any other advice that you think you haven't addressed here that comes to mind that you think is a really important takeaway for kind of an ops director or the MD of the company?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really about embedding change because it's tough.
Hmm.
And I've been in lots of places where they've gone in there and they've tried their best to implement and it hasn't. And there's a number of things that you can do to try and increase the chances of some change management to be implemented successfully. And
Hmm.
ultimately, it's really important to bring people on board and people have got to be up for the change and see the benefit for it. So, as an ops person, you can't do it single handedly. You want to make
Hmm.
sure that you've got a team around you in lots of other areas of the business who are also up for the change, that are keen for it to be implemented, and bring them along and give them the opportunity to share their concerns and to share their views, their recommendations. So then your process becomes everyone's process. It can't just
Mm.
be the ops person's process because it won't stick. So making sure right from the get go that you bring key people in right from the very beginning, that you start off by highlighting, well, what are the problems that we all have? What is it we're trying to fix here? And then
Hmm.
work as a team to try and find out solutions and also to implement it. Then you've got that support. And I think as an ops person, trying to enforce processes by yourself is super tough. But if you've got
Hmm.
advocates in other areas, ideally heading up each team, that
Yeah.
makes a big difference. And they've got an equal role to play to ensure that the new ways of working are enforced, best practices, tools, whatever it might be. And also ensuring, like I mentioned earlier, that the most senior people are also supporting you to do that. And I think it's quite key because I see a lot. People start off with best intentions and things just go back to as they were. And then the problem
Mm.
gets worse because new people join. They can't identify, well, how this particular agency works. So they bring in
Mm.
their own methodologies. And then
Yeah.
they all end up with a lot of chaos because everyone's doing their own thing. And creatives, people seem to think they want the flexibility, but ultimately they don't thrive well in chaos. In
Mm.
fact, they're the ones that need more order than anybody else. So if you put them in an environment where they don't know how things work, they can't produce their best work. And ultimately, that is what the client sees. So a process is there to really aid the quality of the
Mm.
work. If you don't have that really nailed down or ways of working, then it causes
Mhm.
confusion and people just don't work at their best.
Absolutely. Really good point. And so, Manish, if anyone's listening and recognizing that they do need more help and they need kind of external support, tell us about your approach. What would you do once you got that call?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it always starts off with a discovery, really trying to find out what the challenge is. What I want to
Mm.
make sure is, can I genuinely help? I don't blag it. If I don't think I can help, then I'm more than happy to say so or recommend someone else I think is probably better suited. But I'm really trying to spend the time truly understanding what the challenges is and how much work I need to be doing to try and solve it. And it could be a number of conversations. I don't just dive into it, but it
Mm.
may be a number of meetings, talking to maybe the agency owner and then talking to their senior leadership team to get their point of view so I understand what the challenge is and how I might approach it. I might share some of the methodologies about how I might do that and probably would involve an audit and see how they feel about that because it can be
Mhm.
slightly disruptive in the agency having an external person coming in and talking to everyone. But it's really about making sure that I can really help them. And I won't know that
Mm.
until I ask a whole series of questions and really get to the crux of what the challenge is and maybe suggest initially some ideas about how I might fix it. And if they're on
Mhm.
board with it, then we can get started.
Amazing. And if anyone wants to go and try that kind of assessment tool that you've developed on your website, can you tell us where they can find that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's on the website, so they can go to manishkapur.co and it's there. It's a really simple tool. It takes less than 5 minutes to fill out. In fact, most people fill
Okay.
it out within 2 minutes. And it
Yeah.
covers the four pillars that I mentioned earlier around leadership, financial management, people, and process. And it just asks like a series of questions. And on the back of that, then it comes back with a bit of a score to show you how well you're performing. And you also get to see
Mhm.
where you're probably stronger in some areas and less in others. But that will be the
Okay.
first indicator. But the great thing about it is when people fill it out, they've kind of already recognized, so they're not getting many surprises. Just by filling it out, asking a couple of questions, it will highlight where the weakness is and it confirms what they already know, that that's an area of weakness that they've got, but also gives a bit of an indication of where those weaknesses specifically are and where they can get help from.
Hmm. That's fantastic. Manish, we're kind of towards the end of the episode, so I just wanted to come back to that kind of question we started with, where we were talking about how you got into operations, and if there's somebody else like you, like I, that were in whether it was design or project management roles or whatever it was, and feeling like that wasn't the right fit. How do you advise them getting on the path to operations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, unfortunately, at the moment, there isn't like the starting blocks of doing a particular course. So the
Mm,
chances are that you'll join an agency either in a creative role or a client servicing role, project
hmm
manager, whatever it might be. But you've got this feeling that you want to sort stuff out. Ops people are fixers. They want to get in there and they see an issue and they want to solve it. They're not
hmm
moaners. They're not the type of people to go, oh, this is going wrong, that's going wrong. They're more like, we need to fix this. Now, if you
mm,
know that you're that type of person, you're going to make a good ops person because you're particularly proactive and you want to fix it. And so
hmm
that's the first point, just recognizing that you have a need to try and solve issues and solve problems. Being great communicators is another thing. Most agency, problems arise from poor communication, either it being a project or clashes with teams. So being
hmm
a good communicator. So there's a couple of things there that if you recognize that in yourself, you're probably right for an ops role. And then it's really about deciding on if the agency could benefit from it. And the
mm,
way that people transition to it is that they end up doing their day job, that might be project management, and also solving some agency ops issues at the same time. And at that point, they recognize, actually, I quite enjoy this. More
mm,
importantly, though, that the agency owner or the senior leadership team also recognize that they have someone within their agency that is solving a lot of these problems. And maybe that's what
hmm
they need to get into. So most people get into ops kind of moving away from their initial role into an ops role, which is ideally created for them within their agency. And then
hmm
eventually they may decide they want to do that role somewhere else. But that's how people tend to get into that. But I do hope in the future that there is roles and courses out there for people who want to go into ops so they can do that from the beginning and start off in junior roles and then perfect their skills as they get more and more senior.
Definitely. And with all the awareness that's being built by kind of all these groups and conversations that we're having, hopefully that's bound to happen sooner than later, and we can inspire some people at the other end of their career to get into this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's given people an opportunity to do another role within an agency.
Hmm
It opens up for everybody. Before you may go into a particular role, now there's this opportunity within operations that you can go in and support. And the advantage also is that it allows people in who maybe not traditionally come from a creative background, who have an
hmm
interest in working in the creative agency that maybe haven't come through the client servicing route or the design route, but have an interest. And a lot of the operational issues are relevant if it's creative or industrial or whatever it might be. They're all the same. And you can join other forums where there's other ops people and you hear their issues and you can relate to that, to what's going on with the creative industry. So ops carries up a handful of issues that transcend sectors and industries of all sorts. So it
hmm
allows people that maybe want to get into the creative field to get into it without going through the usual sort of channels of starting off as a creative as I did.
Great advice. Manish, I could listen to you speak all day, and I mean that genuinely. I just love hearing your perspective and your thoughts on things. So I can't thank you enough for joining us today and having this
You're
conversation.
welcome.
And perhaps in a future episode, we can have you back and talking about
Absolutely.
something else.
Yeah, definitely.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
That's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. If you want to find out more about Manish, please look him up on his website. It's manishkapur.co. That's manishkapur.co. And as a new podcast, we'd love for you to rate the episode wherever you get your podcasts and share the podcast with someone you think would enjoy listening to it. Lastly, if you've got something you'd like to share with our ops peers on the show, or someone you'd like us to speak to, or a topic that you'd like us to cover, then please DM me on LinkedIn and let me know. My name is Harv Nagra. We'll be back soon with the next episode. Thanks very much. This podcast is brought to you by Scoro, a platform designed for agencies and consultancies, which allows you to manage your projects, finances, and resources, all from one system. This is a platform I brought in at a previous workplace, which completely transformed the way we worked, and which I've recommended to clients of my own. You can sign up for a free trial on Scoro.com. That's SCORO.com. Or reach out to me, Harv Nagra, on LinkedIn if you'd like to hear about some of my experiences.